Hi, this is Stacy, the baby maker Roberts. I have put together more than a decade of my clinical experience into developing the first online mentoring program that deals with the ever-growing area of natural fertility. My Baby Maker Network Mentoring Program is an online interactive program where you will learn how to address all aspects of fertility issues. If you are ready to be a part of an atmosphere that helps you build your practice while helping couples build their family, I look forward to getting to know you in the Baby Maker Mentoring Program. Please go to bioceuticals.com.au and click on the Education tab for more information and to register.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. I'm at the 2016 BioCeuticals Research Symposium. Right now I'm talking with Dr. David Perlmutter, and I think it would be inappropriate for me to read your bio. So I'm going to ask you, can you give us a synopsis, because you've done so much, can you give us a synopsis of what your education, your qualifications are, and how you practice, please?
I would be delighted to. I am a board-certified neurologist. I'm also a fellow of the American College of Nutrition, and I've written a few books along the way, and so I'm a three-time New York Times best-selling author. And interestingly, I just noted this morning that two of my books, Brain Maker and Grain Brain, are both, they're number 1 and number 2 medical nutrition in Australia, where you and I are right now. So I do spend a lot of time writing and teaching. The word doctor in Latin doesn't mean healer, it means teacher. And so I've sort of embraced the notion for my life that the mission is really to teach both lay population and professionals as much as I possibly can.
What was the first point at which you started to realise as a neurologist, a medico, within that pretty tight box of neurology, when you started to go, hang on, something's not right?
I think I realized that even before I was a neurologist. I've always been a pain in the butt. And in my chosen profession of physician, even in medical school, I think I was always out of step because it always seemed to me that we were missing the boat. Modern medicine treats diseases. There's nothing about keeping people healthy.
Yeah.
And that was, my chosen field then became more selective in brain disorders, but it was more focused on how do we keep people healthy in the first place. It seemed to make sense to me. John Kennedy said that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And as I became a neurologist, I joined a mainstream practice and in fact stayed with them for 10 years. Doing the normal things that a neurologist does, basically treating symptoms but ignoring the actual cause of illness, focusing on the smoke but ignoring the fire. And ultimately, I became just too disenchanted with that approach, feeling that that was myopic, that I went out on my own and built my clinic and really focused on trying to understand mechanistically what was going on here. What was this thing called Alzheimer's for which there was no treatment and no cure, affecting now 5.4 million Americans, here in Australia 353,000, and there is no treatment. And it is compelling to me that our most well-respected peer-reviewed journals are replete with citations indicating that lifestyle choices have a huge role to play in determining who does or who doesn't get that situation, and no one's talking about it. So I fell into that niche of being that person who would then raise awareness that, you know what, our day-to-day lifestyle choices are fundamentally important in determining the brain's destiny.
Do you ever remember a time back in your practice as an orthodox neurologist, questioning all the time, I get it, but did you ever see patients who, this is a patient who had a neurological disorder, but might have been on a little bit of a different diet, like a vegetarian diet or something like that, and you went, when you saw their path results or the progression of their disease, you went, that's not quite as bad as what it should be compared to the run-of-the-mill diet that we
Absolutely,
see.
and I really did my best to be sensitive to that sort of experience. that's anecdotal, and they say that the plural of anecdote is data. And I've always maintained that I've learned more from my patients than they have from me. Every patient encounter has been a teaching opportunity from them to me. And then when you see that type of situation, to explore in the medical research as to literature why that might be happening really was very, very revealing. You mentioned vegetarian diet, which I think has its merits, but just to take that apart for just a moment, I believe that, there's a huge movement to embrace the notion that vegetarianism is a very healthful diet for humans. And I would indicate that we need to look at that because by and large, vegetarians are not getting enough dietary fat. They have risks for things like low vitamin D, mineral deficiencies, B12 deficiency, et cetera. So I think making the choice for vegetarianism for whatever reason, we could look at those reasons if they are spiritual reasons or if they are physiological, metabolic reasons, or whatever. There are some ideas that need to be presented to make that a viable choice. There's certainly a precedent of humans eating animal products dating back at least 2.4 million years. That said, our genome has really adapted to respond to that type of diet. And further, our microbiome, that 100 trillion organisms that resides within our intestines, has also been refined to respond to that type of diet. And it doesn't mean going hog wild on meat. Most of our diet should still be vegetable, should still be plant-derived.
Salient points, and indeed a point you made earlier about medicine being myopic. What went on in my mind was Dr. Lauren Cordain, the public father, if you like, of the paleo diet. And his initial call to action, if you like, was to look at myopia and looking at the incidence and what was helping to progress myopia or indeed cause it in humans. I had a conversation with him. So it's interesting you say that about being myopic. With regards to the paleo diet, people often confuse that as being a meat-based diet, but that's not what we found.
I agree with you, and people have often been critical of my book Grain Brain, saying, that's all about eating meat, it's nothing more than an updated Atkins diet. Well, the diet that we are talking about that is most salubrious is the diet that is mostly vegetarian, that adds meat if that's your choice, but tries to cover the bases in terms of what you need. You need protein. Can it be plant-derived? Yeah, it can be. But you need fat. And that is, kind of topsy-turvy with what we've been told. The brain is,
and especially saturated fat.
That's right, saturated fat. How could we be having this conversation? 10 years ago, they would have hauled us off with right. Meat hooks, hopefully. But that said, we recognize fat as a fundamental reason that has allowed humans to survive, and so we could have this conversation today. We tend to think of ourselves as hunter-gatherers, but the reality is we were scavengers for most of our time on this planet, eating whatever was left after the wolves and the hyenas and the vultures had their fill. So we ate bone marrow, basically break open the bones and eat the marrow, which is again, high-fat kind of diet. So fat is back. Should never have left, and it left for economic reasons, which is sad. It's pathetic, basically. But this notion of whole grain goodness, I think, is strongly being challenged, and with good reason, with good literature coming out, really challenging the notion that when we base our diet, our caloric maximums on carbohydrate resources, we're setting the stage for trouble.
I'll go into what we call meat a little bit later, but let's look at, I want to cover grains.
Okay.
Why grains? What triggered your mind to go, it's grains? Because I'm very interested in grasses per se as being this, why we react so allergically to them.
Well, good point. Grains are basically, by definition, the seeds of grass. And that sounds really, it paints a beautiful picture, the waving fields of grass. We're harvesting the seeds and everything is wonderful. But our ancestors, and in fact, for 99.4% of our time walking this planet, there were no wheat fields. There were no grasses growing that we would harvest in big baskets. and then refine and create foods. It didn't exist. So the grain-based foods are a problem for us, at least for three reasons. We'll talk about the gluten issue, those grains that are gluten-containing, wheat, barley, and rye. The second issue is that, by and large, grain-based foods are profound, concentrated sources of detrimental carbohydrate. And the third issue that relates to grains is genetic modification. And the argument with the third contention might be, well, wheat globally isn't generally genetically modified. The big issue with GMO as it relates to food, corn, soy, etc., and as it does secondarily relate to wheat, is because GMO is by and large a situation that we have to allow farmers to spray foods with an herbicide called glyphosate. Yeah. And it is the glyphosate that presents the problem. When the World Health Organization in April of 2015, publishing in the journal The Lancet, you and I would agree, a well-respected journal, calls glyphosate not possible, but a probable human carcinogen, we have to take notice. Because we're looking at 1.35 million metric tons of this stuff being put in our food supply annually. So it is that herbicide that farmers are using on the genetically modified crops. They're genetically modified to allow the glyphosate to be used, kills the weeds, but the corn and the soy are fine. Well, how do we extend that to wheat, which is not genetically modified? Well, in the wisdom of the manufacturers of glyphosate, it was determined that they could leverage the notion that glyphosate would help ripen wheat or desiccate it, giving the ability of the farmers to get that product to market more readily and have a higher profitability. So wheat, at least in America, is aggressively also treated with glyphosate. The next question is, why is it such a problem? And why would the World Health Organization make this correlation between consumption of glyphosate, which is found on our grains, and risk for cancer? Well, it turns out that glyphosate changes our microbiome, alters the array of organisms that live within us, that mediate, for example, our ability to detoxify our environment, detoxify the very things that we're exposed to. One idea. The notion of antibiotics being related to cancer is not new. There was a report in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2004 that demonstrated a dose-responsive issue as it relates to women exposed to antibiotics and risk for breast cancer. And their conclusion, here we are 16 years later, 12 years later, was that these changes were brought on by changes in the microbiome. The detoxification pathways of the microbiome being altered, the changes in how the microbiome deals with hormones, for example, being altered. So there's a long-standing precedent that relates glyphosate exposure to risk for cancer. Now you're wondering probably, well, you just quoted something that dealt with antibiotics and now we're right back to glyphosate. And it turns out that the manufacturer of glyphosate actually patented glyphosate as an antibiotic years ago. Right. I actually use that patent, an image of it, in my presentations. So it's important to note that all of the discussion that people have about the dangers of antibiotics, overusage of antibiotics, which the World Health Organization has characterized as one of the top 2 threats to human health of this decade, all of those discussions about overusage of antibiotics in our livestock, for example, in the doctor's offices, relate back to this glyphosate when you connect the fact that glyphosate is actually an antibiotic.
Your book, Grain Brain, especially, educates patients on how they can change their diet to exclude wheat, but incorporate other pulses, grains, other sources of complex carbohydrates. But it also ties in very well with neurological disorders. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's very interesting with regards to things like autism, but there's a myriad of other complaints. Can you go through those?
And, when I subtitled Grain Brain by stating how wheat, carbs, and sugar are your brain's enemies, it was bold, and people still to this day challenge it, but I think the medical literature is really quite clear. The Mayo Clinic, publishing in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease, highly regarded study, indicated that those individuals in their study that favored carbohydrates in their diet had about an 80% increased risk of becoming demented as they were followed based upon their food frequency questionnaire. Whereas those who had a higher fat resource for their calories had a 48% reduction in risk for developing dementia. So that really is powerful information that fat is good for the brain. When the New England Journal of Medicine in September 2013 published a very interesting report looking at several thousand individuals and looked at them from the perspective of initially their cognitive function, baseline neuropsychometric testing, and one other test. What was that? Their fasting blood sugar. Followed these individuals for 6.7 years and found that those individuals who had even subtle elevations of blood sugar had a profound increased risk for becoming demented. Not at levels to characterize diabetes, but at just subtle elevations above norm. It really makes you recognize that we've got to rein in our blood sugar, and we rein in our blood sugar by lowering our dietary consumption of sugar and carbohydrates. Now, subsequently, and even prior to that, we were seeing reports that focused on glycation of proteins, on hemoglobin A1C, for example, demonstrating that that is a perfect marker of rate of hippocampal atrophy. As the A1C climbs, you see further reduction in size of the brain's memory center, which correlates with Alzheimer's. So we know that when we glycate proteins, when proteins bind to sugars, it presents a situation where increased free radical production happens and increased inflammation is happening as well. And certainly it's not just hemoglobin that is glycated. So an array of proteins are glycated. It happens to be that A1C is what we measure. But even carrier proteins like low-density lipoprotein can become glycated. And as such, when it's glycated, it is oxidized. Glycation increases free radical-mediated stress, and oxidized LDL is a real problem. It is the oxidized LDL that paves the way for atherogenesis, that is actually really causative as it relates to, for example, narrowing of the coronary arteries. The cholesterol is the response. The cholesterol are the firemen that are coming to the injury to fight the fire. And yet, with the observation of cholesterol in the plaque, that motivated the focus of lowering cholesterol as some sort of bizarre treatment for treating coronary artery disease. And, the issue for me is that there's this incredible inverse relationship between Alzheimer's risk and cholesterol, fasting cholesterol. Lower cholesterol levels are associated with a dramatic increased risk for Alzheimer's. Cholesterol is good for the brain. It is an antioxidant in the brain. And beyond the brain, systemically, we need cholesterol. We need the resource from which our bodies manufacture vitamin D. We need the raw material for which our bodies are able to manufacture, from which progesterone, estrogen, testosterone, and even cortisol. So that said, we have to, I think our conversation right now may appear iconoclastic to many, and hopefully it will.
The thing that confuses me is, and I'm going to ask you about it, was that climb in HbA1c, was that adjusted for age? And what I'm meaning here is younger people, or let's say familial hypercholesterolemia, if they also saw a rise in HbA1c combined with their hypercholesterolemia, did they see that reduction in hippocampal area? And the second part of it, there's 5 parts to this question. The other one is you spoke about that we need cholesterol, and yet lower cholesterol, you haven't got the base nutrient to supply to make brain tissue, but then we get changes in raised cholesterol, even though that's what we use to make that base tissue. So it seems to be that's not just the level, but it's what you combine it with and what you do to it.
Okay, let's go back to the first question, and that was is there an age adjustment made on the studies that relate A1C, glycated hemoglobin, to hippocampal atrophy. And what the study did was took a population and basically correlated the metrics of the size of the hippocampus with the A1C. So it wasn't as if a group was chosen and then followed over time as they changed their A1Cs. And, as far as the second question goes, I think that these correlative studies with individuals having higher cholesterol being at risk for coronary artery disease are weak. And I think that those individuals with the higher levels, that we've got to really correct for some other variables that are not looked at, both in terms of lifestyle and in terms of biometrics.
It's very hard for a large study especially to look at multiple factors, and certainly those that are synergistic or combinatory in effects. And where I'm going with this is what I mentioned before, the combination of sugar with high carbs, with wheat,
Absolutely.
with changed fats. How do you start to look at this sort of thing from an integrative perspective without losing the plot, if you like,
Well, by and large, the plot has focused until now on monotherapy, on the notion that, at the end of the line, you see deficiency of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, in certain parts of the brain that seems to correlate with Alzheimer's, that is seen in the Alzheimer's brain post-mortem, for example. And the very myopic approach, which is maintained to the tune of multiple billions of dollars globally in product sales, in pharmaceutical product sales, still is focused on the so-called cholinergic hypothesis. And the great wisdom of the pharmaceutical chemistry, it was thought if we could inhibit the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, that should be very handy in the treatment of Alzheimer's, because we'll have more acetylcholine and that will fix the problem. Well, that's where the cholinesterase inhibitor drugs came into play.
Right.
And it turns out they're ineffective. In over 400 studies, they've been proven useless. And from another perspective, as you and I talk about that, you have to realize that this deficiency of acetylcholine is at the end of a very long cascade of events that pave the way for ultimately apoptosis of those cholinergic neurons and therefore loss of the receptors and the transmitter. So we have to take steps back and say, let's stop focusing on the smoke and look at the fire. What's going on in the first place? And it comes back multiple steps to the notion that Alzheimer's is an inflammatory disorder. And if we look at the genesis of inflammation in human physiology, then we start to look at things like glycation of proteins, at free radical-mediated stress, for example, brought on by elevation of homocysteine, which strongly correlates to Alzheimer's risk. Homocysteine, through its degradation to homocysteic acid, is a powerful enhancement of free radical-mediated pathology, published in the New England Journal of Medicine. And just to focus on homocysteine for one moment, then we'll look at a broader picture. Why then wouldn't there have been such an outcry to pay attention to lowering homocysteine, because we see such a strong correlation with high levels of homocysteine in Alzheimer's and vascular dementia as well, for that matter. And I think the reason is there's nothing proprietary out there. You and I well know that the provision of methyl donors, B6, B12, folic acid, etc., is what we do as integrative practitioners to help lower homocysteine. But you can't own that. It is not patentable. And it brings to mind the idea that, again, mainstream medicine is focused on monotherapy. As it relates to Alzheimer's, it is cholinesterase inhibition or memantine. But that said, NMDA receptor modulation, neither of which is effective, and then even in combination, there is no efficacy. But that said, when we take a broader perspective and recognize that you didn't get into this mess through going through one door, yep. There are multiple factors, as you alluded to just a moment ago, of blood sugar, of inactivity, of stress with elevation of cortisol, of lipid issues, of vitamin deficiency, of mineral toxicity, of hormone imbalance that can conspire and ultimately manifest in a disease that we call by a name, Alzheimer's. Dr. Dale Bredesen at UCLA and also at the Buck Institute in Northern California published in the journal Aging last year a demonstration that when you pay attention to 36 variables, that he was able to actually reverse Alzheimer's in 9 of 10 patients. Putting them back to work, they're writing checks, they're driving their car, balancing their checkbooks, so the brain is very plastic. The brain is very recoverable, and that's maybe the dirty little secret no one wants to talk about.
You just took away my next question.
What was that?
I was basically talking about neuroplasticity. I was recently speaking with Dr. Andrew Heyman, another speaker at the symposium, and he was talking about his work with what we call adrenal fatigue and how we should be really thinking about what causes the cortisol to be, let's say, ineffective. That's a broad brushstroke. And then to treat with interventions that enable neuroplasticity. So apart from the mind games, the ways that you can train your body to enable neuroplasticity, what sort of supplements do you use? What sort of foods do you use that can help us along?
So neuroplasticity and neurogenesis, the growth of new brain cells, are all highly dependent upon brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And in fact, there's a study that was just published in the Journal of the American Medical Association about 7 months ago that demonstrated a wonderful correlation between low levels of BDNF and increased risk for dementia. So we understand that when your body is experiencing the effects of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, the brain is growing new brain cells, which in my day was thought to not exist. And not only that, but the cells are protected against traumas, be they chemical, be they physical. But in addition, the connection of one brain cell to the next, neuroplasticity, is also enhanced. So we need to do everything we possibly can to enhance brain-derived neurotrophic factor. Yeah. And by far and away, the most powerful supplement that you can take right now to boost your BDNF level is called aerobic exercise. Right. There you go. It's not something you buy at the health food store. What you got to buy are a pair of running shoes or whatever. But aerobic exercise.
Shorts are optional.
I don't want to go there. But that said, a recent publication in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease just last month demonstrated, again by the same research team that identified this several years ago, that in those individuals who expend the largest number of energy calories doing aerobics, there's actually an increased size over time in the volumetric measurement of their hippocampus. Their hippocampus is growing with time. Their cognitive performance improves, and their BDNF levels increase. Dr. Erickson, University of Pittsburgh. So there's no patentable medication that can do that, and yet most people have never heard of what we've just discussed. There's a way to reverse the shrinkage of your brain's memory center and to regain memory function, and it's called aerobic exercise. DHA, the omega-3 docosahexaenoic acid, as well, to some degree enhances BDNF production. We know that BDNF production is diminished in the presence of inflammation, and there does seem to be a correlation between higher levels of lipopolysaccharide in laboratory animals, that marker of inflammation and gut permeability, I might add, and lower levels of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So it isn't that challenging.
Comes back right to the gut.
Yep, sure does.
But the issue I have with, I guess, treating the gut is because we like to think of a supplement as a probiotic, but the problem that I see is that certainly in Australia we're restricted to, I think it's 14 species of probiotic organisms, many of them based on milk, some of them based on plants, but we're certainly restricted when you look at the plethora of organisms in the microbiota. And interestingly, some of the research that's coming out now with, for instance, species like Akkermansia mucinifolia and Faecalibacterium proudsnitzii, where we don't have these as probiotics. So we need to be looking at food. Then you look at diet. You've got to take away wheat. What sort of diets are useful?
Well, let me just go back. There are 10,000 or so species of organisms that have been identified. And it would seem at first blush to be compelling to think that we're going to be able to replete each and every one of those organisms. But I think on the other side, we do identify a core group of species that have been the focus of most of the research. We know that Lactobacillus rhamnosus and Lactobacillus plantarum, for example, have key roles to play in maintaining gut barrier integrity, for example. And as it relates to other organisms, like you mentioned, Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, which is seen to be at lower levels in inflammatory bowel disease and, interestingly, lower levels in MS, that the use of you want to go there? Well, we'll go there in a minute.
No,
Okay.
I just had a light bulb.
Oh, good. I like that. I can see it actually. But that other probiotic species will actually work to enhance levels of Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, although you're not specifically giving Faecalibacterium prausnitzii, which, just to take a step back, is interestingly a clostridial species. And here we have been, sort of trained to damn the clostridial species. When we think of Clostridia, we think of, Clostridium tetanus, Clostridium tetani, Clostridium perfringens, Clostridium botulinum, Clostridium difficile.
Devastating.
These are they're enemies. Yeah. And and the reality is your body is loaded with clostridial species right now. 10 to 40% of the bacterial species in your body are in the Firmicutes group of the clostridial subtype. So, and you very likely have a C. diff in your body being held in check by the fact that you have good balance of organisms. Rock the apple cart, change the balance, and certain things will overgrow. When you don't nurture the garden, you're going to get a lot more weeds. So, but you had this light bulb go off.
So, I did. So with regards to the use of these genetically modified wheat that are now loaded with herbicides, which act as an antibiotic, aren't we then now just promoting this upsetting of the apple cart to lead to this maybe silent infection that Andrew Heyman talks about as one of these issues that if you just give some cortisol, you're going to just have a runaway issue with nerve damage and ill health prolonging?
Yes, I mean, your entrance into this feed-forward cycle can come at multiple points. You can jump onto the carousel wherever you like. But, as a point of clarification, we're not really talking about genetic modification of wheat. Nonetheless, it's sprayed with glyphosate, which is, according to its manufacturer, they hold the patent for it, an antibiotic. So all of our discussion with reference to the overusage of antibiotics, the inappropriate usage, the use of antibiotic in the very livestock and poultry that we then consume, really, we can extend that discussion to the fact that glyphosate has entered into our foods and works is a patented antibacterial. And the reason it was approved and allowed in our food is because when it was manufactured, they demonstrated, look, it only has these effects in terms of interrupting the production of aromatic amino acids, the shikimate pathway from carbohydrate precursors. It only happens in plants and in bacteria. So what does Andrew need to worry about? Absolutely nothing. You're not a plant, you're not a bacterium, right?
Guess what?
You're 10 times more bacterium than you are who you think you are. Yeah. So therefore, that discussion is absolutely germane as it relates to humans and our health, and is now beginning to come into the spotlight.
So now to treatment. You're in clinic, you're helping people all the time with neurological disorders. What sort of things do you institute with them, apart from aerobic exercise and the lifestyle changes with regards to breathing, stress, love, music? What practical physical things do you tell them about with regards to diet and maybe some judicial use of supplements?
Well, even beyond that, maybe some judicial use of pharmaceuticals.
Yeah.
For example, symptom management in a Parkinson's patient is something that we need to do. We need to control their rigidity. We need to consider what we can do to control tremor, and those things are important. So we're grateful that we have symptomatic measurement, but that's the tip of the iceberg. We've got to deal with a much bigger problem that's existing below the waterline, and that's the focus. So the first thing is really to concentrate on eliminating those issues that are threatening the microbiome. Why are we so focused on the microbiome? Because the microbiome plays the pivotal role in regulating the permeability of the gut lining. We are focused on the permeability of the gut lining because that is regulating the set point of inflammation and immunity in the entire human body. So I, as a neurologist, am focusing on this one cell layer of epithelium in the gut to leverage that importance in terms of this distant organ, the brain. And, it's time that we understand that there's a lot going on in the body from an integrative perspective, that the gut isn't over here and the brain is over there. They're communicating. And the brain, as you mentioned, via cortisol and other issues, is absolutely influencing gut function and even permeability moment to moment. Cortisol, that you mentioned earlier, when it's secreted during stress, does break down these tight junctions to some degree, and also significantly changes the array, the complexity, the diversity of organisms living within the gut. It also stimulates the production of cytokines, which then feed back and have a negative effect upon the brain. And also those cytokines further damage the tight junctions and lead to further permeability. We set up a feed-forward cycle because what we understand with respect to cortisol is it ultimately is toxic in terms of the hippocampus. So these prolonged elevations of cortisol from stress ultimately prove damaging to the brain's memory center. And even more compelling is the understanding now from Dr. Robert Sapolsky, who has demonstrated that the brain's memory center, in addition to triaging our thoughts and memories and retrieving them, actually serves as a suprahypothalamic brake. What does that mean? It means the hippocampus is controlling how the hypothalamus then stimulates the pituitary that then stimulates the adrenal gland. As we damage the hippocampus, we're releasing the hypothalamus to secrete more and more cortisol that ultimately feeds back again to the hippocampus, damaging it, making the situation a feed-forward cascade. So it's a bit complicated, but it is a dramatic example of tying the gut and the brain together. It is also, I think, a dramatic example of how we need to look upon things like cortisol through two lenses of both being salubrious and being insalubrious. What do I mean by that? Low levels of cortisol help you actually consolidate an event in terms of a memory. But high levels of cortisol are, specifically detrimental. Yeah. So it's not good to say, well, cortisol is bad, cortisol is good. It's obviously there, for a reason.
But there's a fluctuation, not a static
That's right.
thing.
That's exactly right.
So I know this is going to be an extremely piece of string question, particularly
a piece of string question. I don't know what that means.
How long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
Because it's going to be determined by the exact presentation of that patient at that point into your surgery. But what sorts of hints can you give with regards to tests that you might do at baseline and further down the track to measure success of treatment?
Well, at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, I measure success by clinical response. I am not vested in proving an improvement in a laboratory study. That said, I'd like the A1C to come down. I'd like markers of free radical-mediated stress, 8-OHDG, for example, to come down, oxidative damage to lipoproteins to be reduced. I'd like neurocognitive function to be demonstrated improving, as opposed to just having a patient say, I think I'm doing better. Yeah. Homocysteine, et cetera. I think those are valuable. But really what is most important is the patient saying, I'm balancing my checkbook now. I'm able to walk 3 blocks, or whatever that metric may be, which was the reason you saw that person in the first place. That's really most valuable.
Yeah, the things that they couldn't do before that they'd lost.
That is most valuable.
So I have to ask the devil's advocate question. Okay. Is wheat bad for everybody?
Yes. Can I explain?
Please.
And I'm not anti-wheat industry, but wheat products are high sources of carbohydrate, and that's not a good thing for your health. Dr. Alessio Fasano has demonstrated that gluten, and specifically the gliadin, does increase gut permeability in all humans. Now, all humans may not have clinical manifestations of that, and therefore he's been a bit restrictive in saying that everyone should go gluten-free. I'm not of that opinion. I think that if there is an increased gut permeability and therefore the possibility of increased inflammation, et cetera, that we have to look at every possible straw on the camel's back to create the most healthful recommendations And ultimately, it's up to people to decide. But I think that represents a clear and present danger. It is an antigenic challenge for which humans have never adapted.
One more question.
Okay.
One more question. In regards to the SAD, the standard American diet, or the standard Australian diet, whichever you choose,
I like that.
Wheat is a staple. How do we replace that in the general population? We, as natural health practitioners, know about this stuff. Mrs. Jones, who just came down with MS or came in with non-gluten wheat sensitivity or other autoimmune conditions, they're not so versed in dietary advice. How do we chaperone them through, and what alternatives can we give them?
Well, how do we chaperone them through? Again, by teaching and by developing relationships with your patient of trust, of being on the same side of these arguments. I not infrequently explain to patients, I just lost my father of Alzheimer's disease, and I'm probably at great risk because of that inheritance issue. What am I doing? I'm exercising as frequently as I can. I'm I try to avoid gluten and cut my carbs and eat fat and do all the right things. And that said, when we are on the same side of an argument, it tends to draw people in. But beyond that, I do as much media as I possibly can. I write books like Grain Brain and explain with 400 peer-reviewed references why it is that I make these claims. And ultimately, it's going to be up to individuals to either succumb to the notion that you can live your life come what may and hope that modern pharmaceuticals are going to pull you out of your mess. That isn't happening. It really isn't happening. While the treatment of diabetes regulates the blood sugar, it doesn't get rid of your diabetes, and yet you likely can, type 2 diabetes, get back to a place of not requiring medication if you engage in the lifestyle changes that so many are talking about. And by the same token, we don't have treatment for Alzheimer's, and yet we know that the lifestyle choices that we are discussing are valid, and are valid by referencing peer-reviewed medical journals. But people tend to be down on what they're not up on. So there is still a very significant pushback from mainstream medicine, who wants to embrace the notion of one disease, one drug. You say hypertension, I say X. You say Alzheimer's, I say Y. There isn't a Y. But Alzheimer's is preventable, and that's our mission.
So how do you stop Mrs. Jones from going for that white fluffy loaf?
It's her decision.
Yeah.
And
what alternatives do you give them?
Well, we work closely with a dietitian, and we walk people through what your day should look like. By and large, you should be eating less food. And you should be eating, dare I say, more fat. And people end up with their head spinning. But my last 5 doctors have said I need to be choosing low-fat or no-fat foods and eating more complex carbohydrates like grains. And, I explained, look, you've been doing that and you're still gaining weight and your inflammatory markers are elevated, your joints still hurt, you can barely walk around the block now. And face it, you've got a bad pedigree, your father had Alzheimer's or whatever it may be. Try to be as impactful as possible. But I think at the beginning of the day, these people are seeing integrative practitioners because they've had enough of mainstream and it's left them empty-handed.
Dr. David Perlmutter, thank you so much for joining us today. I could go in so many different directions and ask you so many different questions, but of course that would end up being a lecture in which people really need to attend to learn what you've imparted to us today in your lecture at the symposium.
Great.
And indeed, practitioners should be reading your books so that they can get the real message, both for themselves but also to be able to give to their patients. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Excellent interview. I sure appreciate it.
This is FX Medicine, and I'm Andrew Whitfield Cook. This is Andrew from FX Medicine. We thank you so much for your support over the last 2 years. We'd really love to remain clinically relevant to your practice. So if you know of an expert in some area, please let us know. You can contact us on fxmedicine.com.au, Facebook or Twitter.